Good afternoon. I'm in California, so it's actually exactly noon here. I'm Laurie Taylor. I am a professor of anthropology at Clovis Community College in Clovis, California, not New Mexico. We came after y'all, so there's that. And Christine invited me here. So I'm an archaeologist and a biological anthropologist. I have done both private sector and academic archaeology in Texas and the Southwest and California, and a bit in Central America, in Belize. My graduate research was on the California Channel Islands and the archaeology there, specifically the ideas about migration and peopling, and now I teach all of it. So by the way, I'm hoping that like anybody, as we go along, if you guys, I mean, we'll have time at the end for questions, but if you feel like asking questions as we go, or you have anything to share, it's totally fine to unmute yourself and just talk. So when Christine asked me to contribute to the series, and we started a conversation about Supernova 1054, which is a supernova that was visible in the year 1054. And specifically about the, possible presence of native depictions of this event, right? So particularly in the New World and in the Southwest, which is where there's been a lot of talk of this. And I was like, cool, I know about the supernova. I know about the possibility of these, pictographs in particular that that might depict this event. You kind of hear about it and talk about it. I never really dove into it much. So I started to, and when I was reading it, when I got into the literature, I was like, wait, and I knew I had heard things. I knew that there was a really good possibility these weren't actually depictions of this event. But I started to dig more and I was like, oh yeah, no, this has been debunked. There is absolutely no evidence that we can point to any of these pictographs or petroglyphs in the Southwest or in the US, what is now the contiguous US, that actually record this particular event, right? So this is not to say that there aren't depictions of other astronomical events, and then this got me thinking about science and pseudoscience and how much misinformation there is about the past, how important it is, particularly in times like these, to understand the distinction, really understand how to evaluate good data and bad data or no data, and understand the difference between science and pseudoscience. So I talked to Christine. I was like, I'm going to take a little bit of a different turn here. We will talk about the supernova, but mostly what we're going to talk about today is science versus pseudoscience and the sort of dangerous issues that brings up, and especially as it relates to understanding and giving credit to peoples of the past. In this case, native peoples of North America. All right, so this is Supernova 1054 on my right. So I think that's what you should be seeing. This very bright and dark thing here is the Crab Nebula, which is what Supernova 1054 became. I'll tell you a little bit about it. This other sort of chart of the sky that you're seeing is obviously not a photograph of what it looked like in 1054, because that's not a thing, but it is a mock-up. So people who understand the amount of radiant energy and luminosity it would have had produce this. So this is, if you had been in China in the year 1054 and you were looking up at the sky at any of the time that this SN 1054 was visible, this is what you would have seen. It was, in fact, for a while, the brightest object in the night sky. So supernova is a stellar explosion, and essentially what that became is, so it was, that event became visible to people on Earth in July. Now, the dates, if you read some of the data, the dates are very specific. It says July 4th, 1054, which I find super interesting and culturally suspicious. But so it becomes visible in 1054, and it actually stays visible for about 21 months, almost 2 years, right? And at some point, It was so bright that you could see it in the daytime for almost a month, for about 23 days. That's bright. We know all of this because Chinese astronomers, early scientists in China, wrote it down. And if we know anything about data, then you know that when something gets written, that's a good thing. It tends to change less over time than oral transmission of information does. You obviously have to validate things, but we have a number of Chinese texts where they're from different people in different places, not associated, that record this event as having happened, been seen. We know a lot of the details because of these historical artifacts, right? Data, good scientific data. Later, they found some, one Japanese report that mentions the event. Later after that, they found one text in an Arab context on the Arabian Peninsula that's probably actually can trace it to maybe someone in Turkey who saw this event. So of course it's so interesting, right? And we are interested, as modern humans in celestial, stuff as anybody in time was. So people are writing it down. We want to know about peoples of the past and our understanding of things. Very cool, right? And traceable and documentable and good data. Then there was speculation, well, if people could see this and wrote it down in China and other places, then why not in Europe? And is there evidence of it in the New World as well? So some people found some documents talking about some, astronomical events in Europe. For a long time, they contended that this was the event they were talking about. People subsequently did more research and they just don't match up. The descriptions, the times, all that stuff doesn't match, right? By the way, SN 1054 is one of like 5 or so, I think is the number, supernova events like this that in the last 1500 years. And then there are comets as well. So there's other celestial events that humans could see and might write about. That's why data and understanding how science works and the veracity of artifacts is so important. So Europe people decide that this has not been recorded. But then there's this issue of the New World. And the New World is trickier, of course, because we don't have writing systems like the Old World. And I want to be very clear. New World peoples were as sophisticated as anyone else on the planet. They just did things differently, right? They have writing systems. They're not the kinds of writing systems. They're not letter-based. They're pictograph-based. And they tell stories, fantastical stories, amazing things. They're super complicated. They built great buildings and they did a lot. They didn't have the same writing system, so we don't have the same documents. And what we did have was destroyed by the Spanish. So that's also problematic. So anyway, the New World, people turn their attention to the New World. And in 1955, this man named William Miller is a photographer for the Palomar Observatory in north of San Diego in Palomar, right? And he's out there doing work for the observatory, and he notices this is not a picture of what Mr. Miller saw, because there are no really good photographs of that. The 2 sites he was at were really kind of out of the way, and they're not. Anyway, this is a picture of Chaco Canyon, and it's relevant. So he takes some pictures of this. It's similar, of essentially what he argues are pictographs. So that's painting as opposed to etching on rock in 2 different places, in 2 different sites. One is called White Mesa and the other Navajo Canyon. And he argues that they are a star and a crescent moon, much like what we're seeing here. So the star would be to the left of that crescent moon with that sort of hand shape, but also could be a star there. And then the crescent moon. And he basically publishes the photos, and with it, he says, this might be this event, SN 1054. He's speculating. He says he's speculating. He says, seems like it. Seems like, I know it was occupied at the time when it first emerged, when the event was first visible in July, probably like the first day or 2. It would have low on the eastern sky and the horizon been close to a waning crescent moon, right? And it would have been so bright. It would have been this very, surprising event. And so why not this? Why not this? Oh, sorry, that was wrong direction there. And it just kept traction, much like, you know, like a game of telephone, right? Somebody says something, it sounds like a good idea, and other people pick up on it, and it just becomes what's understood to be true. And I think we all know very well now in the age of the internet and immediate transfer of information what that's like. How quickly something can go from speculation or idea or thought to canon and believed facts so quickly, right? And that's what happens essentially. There's a little bit of hyperbole, but basically from then on, every time somebody sees a crescent moon pictograph, they're like, ah, that's that supernova event. Nobody actually researched it. Nobody bothered to do the details at the time, right? And then when people did, they essentially just went in and were like, yep, this makes sense. And then they just kind of cataloged a bunch of other similar pictographs from perhaps similar time of these two sites and region, and we're like, and you know, because they're there, you know, this is how we're shoring up our idea. This is not good science, right? There's a whole bunch wrong with this. Now we move into the modern age, and I mean the modern age is obviously in the 1920, I mean in the 1900s it's happening, but as we move forward in time, we get people actually looking at the question with sort of a very skeptical eye, and people, for one, who went to the original two sites, right? And it turns out that they're not even clearly stars and crescents, right? One of them is, first of all, looks very new compared to other material, which means, you know, no one dated it. No one tried to take any samples or do anything at the time. And it looks like it was produced well after this, what would have been, you know, 1054 and other pictographs in that site. It's also not clearly representative of what what Miller said it was. It could be, again, it's open to interpretation, unfortunately, which is what happens with time and exposed materials and a lack of cultural understanding of the people of the time and what their essentially artistic style was. What were they doing? If you don't know anything about the area and you haven't read anything about the peoples of the area, to presume you can then just say you know what it is really, I mean, I'm just going to say it. I feel like it's disrespectful to the people, disrespectful to scientists who have spent time and do spend time and ask questions that are meant to be refuted. We're trying to get a no, right? So anyway, scientists, a number of people, astronomers and archaeologists. The other thing is these weren't archaeologists who were doing the initial looking, or anthropologists. So this is debunked. The problem is and the other one, by the way, is clearly, like, it's in the middle. The one from Navajo Canyon, sorry, the name escaped me, is just like embedded in a much larger imagery, and it's very likely not even a star or a crescent moon or anything. The problem here is it just became accepted knowledge, even though a number of really solid research and journal articles have been published debunking this. It is in fact just still repeated to this day by good scientists as fact. I have included two links here. One is to a NASA associated website actually, and I'm not sure if I click on this, I think I have to. Can you guys see this? The new image that's up, or no? Are you still just seeing the PowerPoint?
We're seeing the PowerPoint.
Okay, you're not seeing it. All right, yeah. Anyway, I'm not going to try to unshare and reshare, but I'll just tell you that there are, you know, and I'm sure many of you have heard of this, and you just assume that, yes, there are these Southwest sites where this astronomical event has been recorded, and you can just Google it and find all sorts of reputable and just sort of colloquial sites that are repeating this. This is the problem when we don't consider science as separate from other bodies of knowledge. It's not folklore, and it's not just popular discussion, right? Science has to be testable and refutable, and when it's not, and we don't make that distinction, it can be problematic. So this is what led me into this, thinking about what I wanted to do with the rest of this conversation, which was still center it on the New World and archaeology and prehistory, but talk about the issues here. So archaeology and prehistory are somehow uniquely, are often, like more often than not than other subjects, the center focus of pseudoscience, hoaxes, just general misinformation, and they spread quickly, right? I have this picture of phrenology, of course, the now debunked pseudoscience of reading the contours of the human skull to tell people all sorts of things about themselves, like, their personality traits and their character and, just all the things that your skull doesn't tell you. Just to be clear, the shape and size of skulls tells us almost nothing about humans, including how closely they related to each other. So the question is, why are we so, why is archaeology and prehistory so interesting to people who are not trying to do good science? We like ourselves. We're really into stories about ourselves, and the past is fascinating. I'm an anthropologist. The study, the field of anthropology is the study of trying to know what it means to be human in all times and all places from all perspectives. We are the egocentric species. So telling our story, knowing our story is part of what it means to be human. And then the past is fantastical, partly because until, relatively recently, you really couldn't test a lot of it, and you could make up stories about it. Anything almost can be possible when you're looking at, historical relics, if you will. So, and people like to believe, fantastical things, right? I think you guys can, if you just think about it for 1 second, you can conjure up a bunch of current popular viewing or ideas that are sort of based in archaeology and prehistory and either pseudoscience or just blatant misinformation. I'm going to go with 95% of the programming on the Discovery Channel and the History Channel now. The History Channel needs to change its name. Is this, right? And it works. People like it. It's super entertaining. The problem is it's never accurate. And it's less than never accurate. It's affrontive, right? To science and to peoples of the past. So pseudoscience, just in case anybody's unclear, is I've included the dictionary definition is a system of theories, and they're using theory very loosely here. So I'm going to go with ideas, assumptions, and methods erroneously regarded as scientific. So at any time when you're presenting information in the guise of, you wrapped it up in a package of scientific and it's false, whether you mean it to be or not, it's pseudoscience, right? So just before we get started, I'm going to give you basically what we're going to do is I'm going to use two archaeological examples of misinformation and pseudoscience. And we're going to kind of unpack it. I'll talk about what was actually going on with the people in these instances, and then why these stories were kind of built up and what's dangerous about that. So when you're trying to evaluate whether something is science or pseudoscience, I like to kind of walk people through a bit of a checklist. So one, always consider the sources, right? Who are these people? If we take something that we're all familiar with that is in fact pseudoscience, like Ancient Aliens, right? That television show. Often you'll get people who look like experts, right? They have letters after their names and they're wearing a tie, or they might have crazy hair, but they're wearing a tie, and they're dressed up. Maybe they're having a lab coat on or whatever. Most of those people are not archaeologists or anthropologists. They have nothing to do with the field. They're adjacent, right? They might be somehow related, but if you look at a lot of this in pseudoscience, the sources they use might look fancy, but they have very little to do with the actual subject matter. Or maybe they called an archaeologist and they were like, hey, we have this crazy idea that aliens built the pyramids. And the archaeologist says, wow, that's cool. And they hang up, and then they use a quote that says, so-and-so archaeologist says this idea is cool, right? So they're lending credence to something by sort of falsifying who these experts are. Or people are just lying. People also lie. And then, so sorry. So it's always good to look at the sources. And then what kinds of language are they using? Generally speaking, scientists do not write in declarative statements. We always leave it open, the idea open that we know what we know now and that knowledge builds on itself and this might change. Gravity is at play at the moment. Fingers crossed it's going to stay that way. Can I say that that's going to be the case with, at all time in all places under all conditions? It cannot. So if there's a lot of declarative statements, if this is the truth, sort of things, if it's, we know the answer and clearly this is it, or the great ruse of, because this isn't there, then this happened, or the best when the language is, let them prove me wrong. No, if you made the claim, you have to prove yourself, right? Or, you have to do the testing. It is not the expert's job to debunk a crazy idea someone has. That's also not science. So if they're using that kind of language, not scientific. If they're making extraordinary claims, things that seem outside of the realm of real, if they're completely untestable, I like to tell my intro to biological anthropology students when we're talking about testable versus untestable, I say, let's just run a thing by you. So if I tell you that the moon is made of cheese, is this a testable hypothesis? Yes, it's testable, right? You can go to the moon, eat a little bit. I don't know, take it, say, do a sample, see if it's cheese, right? Don't eat that, don't do that. So if I tell you the moon is made by leprechauns, what have we got, right? I mean, it's probably true. I'm joking. No, it's untestable. It's extraordinary and untestable, right? It's not science. And then finally, resources. It's the money, right? I'm guessing the Discovery Channel didn't make the mermaid skeleton docudrama because they really want to uncover the truth about mermaids. People like it, and it pays the bills. There's all kinds of reasons why people falsify information and make up misinformation. And it's good to look at the resources involved if you're trying to evaluate things. So, okay, we know how to differentiate between science and pseudoscience. We know how important good data is. So I want to talk about, there are so many really to choose from. Unfortunately, there's so many archaeological hoaxes and just misunderstanding, misinterpreting, and purposeful misinformation about the past. It's disheartening. I'm constantly having to, when someone hears I'm an archaeologist, the first few questions are always like just strange, and they're often based in misinformation and misunderstanding. That and like, have you ever found gold? Apparently everyone thinks we just find gold every day, and that we get to keep it. I mean, that'd be a great job, but that's not the job. So I just find gold every day and I keep it. So there are a lot of these, but I chose two that are New World and like contiguous, what is now the contiguous US. And I think like impactful for like the damage they have and can do. So I'm not sure if you all know, but for about 4,000 years, and largely concentrated in the South and like North, Central, East. I mean, I'm calling that like the Ohio area. It's not quite the Midwest still, but and then a little bit you'll see here into Texas, Louisiana, and then even stretching into Iowa. Were a bunch of people, native peoples, who for a time had shared a culture tradition of building earthen mounds. Now, those people, if you see in this, on this map, I can kind of try to enlarge it here, you'll see all of these names: the Adena, the Hopewell, the Ohio Hopewell, Mississippian, Caddoan, Oneata. These are names archaeologists assigned to these people. These are not what they called themselves. We don't actually have any written records. Most of these people had dissipated into larger groups at the time. And so, how distinct they are from one another is often, I don't want to get in the weeds of this in archaeology terms, but based on really sort of odd distinctions like pottery typology or, tool technology or time and space, right? So largely what these are is over time and space. We just kind of change the names as we go if it looks like people left and other people came in, or As a group, we call them the Mound Builders because they built large earthen mounds like this one. I love these. I love the Mound Builders. And I really love it because I don't think, well, New World archaeology doesn't get as much hype as everybody else's, especially the US, because we don't have monumental architecture. And that's sexy and people really like it. But you know what's really cool? This weird snake-shaped mound that took so much effort to build, right? I mean, this is not an archaeology class, and so I'm not going to get into it, but you can imagine the human effort and organization this takes, right? These were complex societies of people. This is an effigy mound. This is just, this actually serves very little function. It is in memoriam, essentially, right? They have other mounds that are, in fact, a lot of them are burial mounds. So they build them, they cover them with dirt, and then grass grows on them, foliage grows on them, and then the bodies are put in lengthwise, you know, on either side usually. But they also built mounds. They also built sort of large areas where different mounds. These have all been essentially tamped down by time and, you know, erosion. But many times they're flattened out. Sort of the people in charge either conducted business in structures on top of them or lived there. People lived around them. These are big, complex societies of many thousands of people, right? Obviously, it takes that much to build these sorts of things. This is one of my favorites because it's in Iowa. It's actually the kind of eastern edge of things. But they build a lot of effigy mounds in the shapes of different animals. This is a bear-shaped mound. I just think it's adorable and cool. And not surprising to me that the people in this area were able to do this. We do great things. And at this time, people were building monumental architecture in the Yucatan and in Central, you know, America. They were doing cool things in Asia. We were doing cool things too. It's just that ours are made of earth and they erode and things grow over them and they're hard to find and nobody wrote it down. So these are the mound builder cultures, right? So when the Europeans get here, they obviously encounter natives who are still, many of them living in some of these. Now, at the time, just because of processes of culture change, a lot of these large communities could no longer sustain themselves for various reasons, and they dissipated, and some of them die off, and some of them join other groups, and they just don't have that time or energy to put into this kind of technology, this mound building at the time. But they're here, obviously, and some of them are still doing this. Fast forward to the 1700s. This is Thomas Jefferson. And this is Monticello. Thomas Jefferson, sometimes you'll hear described as the father of American archaeology. I just want to tell you, I don't know a single archaeologist who has ever said this. This is not a thing we like talk about or pride ourselves on. What I do know is he did conduct some essentially avocational archaeological exploration, including on a burial mound that was on one of his properties. And so he knew about these. Lots of people did. And I'll get back to him in a second. So sorry, I keep pushing buttons I shouldn't be pushing. So these mounds, people are uncovering them. If you know anything about the sort of US government narrative and the settler narrative of Native Americans, it wasn't good. It was a mass genocide. And to sort of explain that away and to make everybody okay with that, you have to build a narrative that somehow these people are not as worthy, as close to God, as fully human, as culturally competent, whatever it is, to sort of make the case for why Europeans need to take over, right? And that's happening. Out of that comes, but these mounds are amazing. So those two things don't match up. So people start to build this idea that, and we call it the mound builder myth. They start saying that this is their scientific explanation, that the mounds were not in fact built by native peoples to the US, the ones who were here when Europeans arrived, but instead a much cooler, smarter group of people who were here before the Native Americans. And then the Native Americans showed up, probably from South America, and murdered them. So that's the idea, right? It's crazy, but it really became the idea of the time that no, the people who are here were not able to do this. And so clearly it was a superior race of people that the Native Americans, that they just ruined everything. They showed up, killed all these people, and wouldn't that have been cool if those other people were still here? So Thomas Jefferson, for his part, did not buy into this idea. He, in fact, clearly stated that he thought they were related to the native peoples of the area, and he observed a group of native peoples return to an abandoned burial mound and hold essentially what looked like a remembrance ceremony. He said people looked really sad when they were leaving. So, but still, this became the idea of the day. And the reasons why, well, let me tell you. Because these are all still things that we do. So I just want you to know, we're talking about mound builders and we're talking about the 1700s, but these same ideas resurface time and time again and they become sort of settled in the collective consciousness, right? And we'll talk about a more modern example. But this is why all of that programming is still possible now and why we can tell these stories. So one, native peoples are just too primitive. They didn't have the technology, couldn't figure it out, weren't sophisticated enough, right? That was the idea. So how could they possibly build these giant earthworks? Two, the mounds are just too old. I want you to know that nobody even knew that the New World existed and that tens of millions of people were here. So no, they did not have a great handle on the age of the New World and how long people had been here. By the way, it's about 18,000 years, like by our best guesses. First migrations by boat. It's been a minute. They had a long time to get good at this, right? But again, unscientific. They're just making stuff up and it becomes, the assumption becomes the fact. Mounds are too old. They predate these people. Must be those other fancy people they killed off. Here's a good one, and it ties in a lot of things. This is a straight up hoax. In a number of these mounds, they found, I think the Davenport tablet was the first one. And then lo and behold, they started finding things like this, different, but similar at different mound sites. These weird little stone tablets that had indecipherable writing on them, but they were clearly not Native American writing systems, pictographs, nothing that looked like in a Native American tradition. So then they argued, and many of them thought they were, if you'll see here, old world. So they were like, oh, Europeans were here first. They built them because, that's the goal, right? Is that all roads lead back to Europe. So these are all straight up fake. In fact, the Grave Creek tablet here, this one has like 15 different translations from like 15 different people, and they're crazy. I mean, some of them are, in fact, let me just get out of full screen mode for 1 second and I will read a couple of them to you. So one, like between about 1857 and 1875, they were translated like by a lot of people. They kept giving people, but this is just for the same little Grave Creek tablet. Somebody, Maurice Schwab, thought it said, the chief of immigration who reached these places or this island has fixed these statutes forever. So apparently it's statutes, it's some laws that they think this person thought it said. This is my favorite one. The grave of one who was assassinated here. May God to avenge him strike his murderer, cutting off the hand to his existence. So that's what one other person thought it said. One said, I pray to Christ, his most holy mother, son, Holy Ghost, Jesus Christ, God. You won't be surprised to find out this is from a Catholic scholar who interpreted that. And then in the 20th century, one person translated it as the mound raised on high for Tassac, which is a person whose name he made up. This tile his queen caused to be made. So,
Laurie?
yes.
Did you mean to minimize your PowerPoint presentation?
I did not mean, well, yes, I did, but okay. I didn't mean to minimize it so much. But thank you. Yeah, I'm trying to get it back to where we need to be. Something strange is happening to the PowerPoint. 1 second. I know, I'm so sorry. PowerPoint is thinking is what it looks like. Shiza. Hold on. I think my PowerPoint is frozen, y'all. Okay, there we go. We're back. Nope, I don't want to sign in. Thank you, ma'am. Apparently PowerPoint is a ma'am. There we go. All right, here we go.
All right.
Oh, these are the crazy interpretations or translations, false translations, obviously, of a hoax. Again, this is an archaeological hoax meant to show that these Native Americans couldn't have done this. The other argument was that no Europeans saw Native peoples building mounds, so they didn't do it. And this, in fact, there's a lot more evidence to state that that's just to support that's not true. But this, in fact, is a picture made by a real European, Jacques Lemoine, in 1560, which shows a bunch of Native peoples and a mound. So the Europeans. Did I just mute? Can you hear me now?
I did. I'm sorry. I did.
No, that's okay. And then finally, there were metal objects. There were copper and silver objects found in a lot of these, well, not a lot, but in some of them. And again, feeding in the narrative that they didn't think Native peoples were capable of metallurgy. So they just thought, oh, that can't be them. But in fact, there were a number of groups north of Mexico who were at this time using copper and silver, and that's what was found in the mounds. So the question then is, why is this dangerous? That guy's face makes me laugh every time. They're rooted in racist ideology. This is using science again, or pseudoscience as it were, to reify and shore up erroneous, false, bad ideas about culture and evolution and civilization, and to use it to oppress a group of people. And what it ultimately does is it robs peoples of the past of what they deserve, right? Of the acknowledgement they should have. Now, the thing about the mounds is that these are all testable. This is, you can go in and you can, as has been done, you can test these things, date them, gather data, prove the tablets to be false, all that stuff. Some of the pseudoscience and misinformation is more fantastical, and it's catchier, it catches on faster, it's more popular, and it's not hard for a science to debunk it. I mean, we don't have to, it's not even our job, but it is hard to sort of knock it out of the public imagination because it's not like something you can just always put a shovel into and prove otherwise. So this is our transition to ancient alien astronauts and other really great scientific hypotheses. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of a lovely man called Eric von Daniken, but in the 60s, archaeology has always been popular, but in the mid-century, it was really ramping up. It was becoming government work projects were pumping a bunch of money into archaeology and anthropology around the globe, actually, after World War II. And so we have this sort of interest in, our past, of this sort of surging interest in our past, coupled with the space race. And you get this, what comes out to be an unholy alliance, the book of Chariots of the Gods by Eric von Daniken in 1968, where he just says a bunch of crazy stuff, but he says it very authoritatively. He goes through the pseudoscience checklist expertly and really creates this false idea. But it catches on, and we are still living in the smog of this book. So his hypothesis, and again, I use this loosely, it's not a hypothesis. It was never meant to be tested. A hypothesis is a testable idea. This is just crazy talk. But what he said has come to be known as the ancient astronaut hypothesis. So here are his beliefs, if you will, that he purports in this book. 1, extraterrestrials mated with peoples of the past. So what he says is that early humans were not capable of doing any of this stuff. And clearly aliens showed up and mated with those people. And that's how we became modern humans, not through evolution, but through alien intervention. 2, anything we see in terms of pictographs and petroglyphs that we don't understand or can't interpret correctly and look kind of weird, definitely, essentially eyewitness sketches of aliens. And 3, people of the past were just too stupid to build any of this stuff without help. I mean, I'm obviously paraphrasing, but that's his hypothesis. that's his ideas, and he ramps up over the years. He never backs down, and he just keeps feeding into these ideas, which is amazing. So these are some petroglyphs and pictographs. These are some petroglyphs, actually. So these are carved, not painted. But this is the kind of stuff Van Doniken's talking about when he's trying to say that these are eyewitness drawings of aliens, because they don't look like people. Now, again, silly, salacious, completely unscientific. It's also just disrespectful to Native peoples and other people who have studied, living Native peoples and people who have studied the culture history of the areas, right, that he's talking about, right? Because we know a lot of these are kachinas or they're other sort of sacred imagery. Some of them may actually just be drawings of things, people messing around. We allow people in our time to experiment, right, with art. We have all kinds of art. Contemporary people that we know, like in our lifetimes, our contemporaries and peoples of the historic past are allowed to draw and paint in any style they want. We really pigeonhole Native peoples around the world, and then prehistoric peoples and living Native peoples and prehistoric peoples as like they're just supposed to be realistic and just drawing things they see. Like it's like a newspaper, right? They're like, oh, I see, a deer and this fish and that thing, and they have no imagination. And therefore, if you pull that string, they're simple, they're not sophisticated, and they can't think for themselves. And so, aliens. Here's how this gets really kind of fluoresces and becomes part of the popular canon, if you will. This is just a very colorful map for you to see. It's essentially it's not specific, but it is Mesoamerica and showing you all the Native peoples who lived in the region, over many thousands of years. But we're zeroing in here on the side of Palenque in Chiapas. It's a beautiful Maya site. If any of you have ever been, I encourage you to go. It's just gorgeous. So if you know anything about the Maya had complex political systems. In fact, it's probably their downfall. They were way into their politics and competition and not paying enough attention to their collapsing landscape. They were building a lot of cool buildings and writing cool stories about themselves, but ultimately, it wasn't sustainable. So one of the leaders of Pakal, who had a really long run, like 63 years, I think, of Palenque, is Pakal the Great, or Kinish Janap Pakal, which is his Maya name. This is his death mask of jade, and this is one of the stela depicting Pakal. He inherited this rule from his mother, and again, this isn't archaeology class, but if you're interested at all, Palenque in general is such a cool story. When Pakal died, he was buried here in the Temple of the Inscriptions, which is, again, this site is just stunning. It's one of the more breathtaking places I've ever been in the world. Specifically here, the tomb is inside the Temple of the Inscriptions. This is a good long view or aerial view of Palenque. So here's the tomb. It was built in 692. We know all of this from lots of reasons, but one is some of the codices that survived and the stela themselves at the sites. There's all these little, stairways and things. It's very secured in the bottom here. And what you'll see around the edges of this picture are all of the, most of the grave goods that were included, including this, which is the lid of his sarcophagus. I've been down here. You can no longer go. I've actually seen this when the sarcophagus was still in situ, but it's been loved to death. So you can no longer go in here. Here is this giant sarcophagus lid. It is massively heavy and intricately carved with a picture of Pakal preparing to descend into Xibalba, which is the afterworld in the Maya cosmology, right? And we all know this because people have spent years and years and years, now hundreds of years studying what codices survived. Epigraphers have spent all this time, and Michael Groff's going to be talking to you in a few weeks, I think. And Michael works in the area, you know, so we know a lot of information. But Van Doniken, not an anthropologist, not an archaeologist, sees these inscriptions and decides to just go way off the rails and make up an entire story. And the story is that Pakal is not, in fact, just died and going, you know, fulfilling essentially the Maya Book of the Dead, you know, story of what happens when he goes to Xibalba. But no, none of it. It's none of their past stories. It has nothing to do with Maya tradition, belief system, epigraphy, nothing. This is him in a spaceship about to go back to outer space. It's come to be known as Pakal the Astronaut. I know it sounds insane, but let me just show you this. So this is from his book. This is the lid. Mind you, much of this iconography has been decoded by anthropologists and epigraphers. And so here we go. Up here at the top, we're looking, it says God from skies. That's guiding the space, because you need a God to come and, you know, pull the spacecraft up. This is New World found, human beings are present, and the Mayan peoples make a home. This is very top, essentially, right? The lintel up here, it's not a lintel, it's a word door, it would be. I'm happy about the sides here. It says symbols representing extraterrestrials. He just randomly finds some stuff he doesn't understand. He's like, these are aliens, and y'all will believe me. And then he just, this says symbol for baby Mayan, indicating that the travelers left their seed in the New World. So he's setting up, you know, he's using this, he's created a false idea of these extraterrestrials mating with modern peoples. And then he's using this to reify and shore up his fake idea. So he's lying to support his lie, right? But it's cool. I mean, if you read this stuff, that's an oxygen system. What's going into his nose there? Oxygen, because he's an alien and he's going to outer space, but oxygen definitely still necessary. There's so much here, but you know, and you should, if you want to look more, you can read into this. But so this seems crazy to us. I mean, at least it does to me. But the problem is it doesn't seem crazy to everyone. And in fact, it's way cooler than explaining the actual painstaking science and the lack of data and what we're probably never going to know and what we can't say for sure and the stories we can't tell because we have to respect the data, right? So that's the problem. And the other problem, and the big one, is that it's disrespectful, and it's essentially continuing that racist, disrespectful narrative that peoples of the past were not capable of doing anything, right? If it can't be Europeans like the Mound Builders, then it must be aliens. That's really problematic. And it gets worse. I mean, he says he goes full racist by the 80s. He just, in his next book, or one of his next books, he really goes crazy. Signs of the Gods. I won't bring it up here, but if you want to look it up, you can. But it's not just him, right? And I know people don't realize that they're doing it, but they are, right? They are, in fact, it's taking away from the legacy. We stand on the shoulders of the intellectual giants who came before us. And those are all peoples of the past, most of them native peoples, and they are owed that respect. It's a very impassioned ending, so I'm sorry. Any questions? I will mute myself. And I'm going to stop. Well, now I'm going to leave it up.
I wanted to just kind of make a point that I'm glad you brought up that these things still happen, because fairly recently we were at a local site where on the summer equinox, and there was a person who presumably was an academic giving a tour who made the statement that natives didn't really know what they were doing and never observed the skies. And this was during the summer equinox at a local site. And it's unfortunate that these things still happen.
It is really unfortunate. And in fact, I'm just going to go all the way back to the beginning to show you that picture I used from Chaco Canyon, which I'm sure most of you know is a huge important site in New Mexico. This is probably not SN 1054, but it is an astronomical event, right? Some people have speculated that the star looks like it has a little tail, which might be a comet because supernovas don't have tails. Comets are doing something different. It could be Halley's Comet. So here's the thing, SN 1054 came about 10 years, I think. Yeah, Halley's Comet came through, I think, in 1066. It was visible then. Would have been extremely bright as well. Would have been quite an event to see. So Native peoples are absolutely, archaeoastronomy is real. And the reason, you know, I know it's kind of a jump, but the reason I chose things like these mounds is this is engineering, right? This is a feat of engineering. They're absolutely capable of this. And yes, people are, and who was that woman, Christine? She was a docent, or who was she?
When?
The woman who said that natives didn't really pay attention to the.
Oh, she actually, it was a man, was leading a tour at a local site during the equinox.
Yeah, so they're leading tours, right? And I'm sure he wasn't intentionally trying to pass on, you know, bad information, but it's bad science. It is misinformation, but it's just horribly disrespectful, you know? And it's, you know, it's important. I think it's incumbent upon all of us who care about it to like make sure that when these things come up, that we sort of challenge the science and say, hey, does that seem reasonable? Why do you think aliens did that? Why not a person?
Yeah. And I think most, if not all, arc sites in Mesoamerica have observatories.
Yes, exactly.
So science in native cultures is definitely prominent in cultures around the world.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And merely because it didn't get written down doesn't mean it's less sophisticated or less scientific, you know?
Exactly. Yeah.
It's our fault because we don't understand it.
And if anyone here locally in Albuquerque hasn't been to Petroglyph National Monument, there's plenty of petroglyphs there, hence the name. And there's actually a couple examples of observations or drawings of stars and things of that nature, but who really knows?
Yeah, no, and thank you for bringing that up, Christine, because when I'm saying these are probably not SN 1054 again, that's not that astronomical events weren't recorded. It's just, you know, I was just using it as a jumping off point, but you're right. There are tons of petroglyphs and pictographs in the region. Y'all are in a great, if you're in the Albuquerque area, you're in a very cool region for archaeology.
Exactly. So does anyone have any other questions before we end this session? You're welcome to unmute yourself and speak up.